Welcome to Nation Scope, where the past explains the borders you live with today. In the early 1800s, a single political entity stretching from California to Patagonia was not a fantasy. It was a real possibility. The leaders existed. The armies existed. The dream existed. So why did it collapse while the United States held together? This is not a story of missed chances. It's a story of power, geography, elites, and decisions that still shape Latin America today. When people ask why Latin America never became a single country like the United States, they usually start in the wrong place. They start in 1820 with independence. The real answer begins 3 centuries earlier, inside the machinery of the Spanish Empire. Spain did not colonize the Americas to build settler republics. It colonized to extract wealth, fast, centralized, and controlled. From the very beginning, Spanish America was organized not as one unified territory, but as several administrative kingdoms called viceroyalties. New Spain governed Mexico and Central America. Peru controlled much of South America. Later came New Granada and Rio de la Plata. These were not provinces. They were semi-independent imperial units, each reporting directly to Madrid, each designed to function on its own. This mattered more than people realize. British North America developed local self-rule almost by accident. Colonists governed town councils, colonial assemblies, and militias for generations before independence. By the time Britain tried to tighten control, Americans already thought of themselves as political actors. Spain never allowed that. Power flowed downward from the crown, not upward from the people. Local elites, called criollos, were wealthy, educated, and influential, but they were locked out of the highest imperial offices, which were reserved for Spaniards born in Europe. This created a dangerous contradiction. Criollos controlled land, labor, and local economies, but had no experience running sovereign states. When independence finally came, they inherited territory without institutions strong enough to bind it together. Geography made everything worse. The United States expanded across relatively flat land connected by navigable rivers. Latin America was cut apart by mountain ranges, jungles, deserts, and vast distances. The Andes alone acted like a stone wall running the length of a continent. Communication between regions took weeks or months. Trade flowed outward to Europe, not sideways to neighboring colonies. Lima traded more with Spain than with Buenos Aires. Mexico City was economically closer to Seville than to Bogotá. By the time independence movements erupted in the early 19th century, Latin America was not one society waiting to unite. It was a collection of regions that barely knew each other. Then came Napoleon. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain and captured King Ferdinand VII. Overnight, the Spanish Empire lost its center of authority. Across the Americas, local juntas formed, claiming to govern in the king's absence. At first, these were not revolutionary movements. They were loyalty movements. But once power was tasted locally, it could not be returned easily. Wars of independence followed, and they were brutal. Unlike the American Revolution, which was relatively short and geographically contained, Latin America's wars dragged on for over a decade. Entire regions were devastated. Economies collapsed. Infrastructure was destroyed. Trust between provinces evaporated. Out of this chaos emerged men with vision: Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, Francisco de Miranda, leaders who genuinely believed in a united Latin America. Bolívar, in particular, dreamed of a single great republic called Gran Colombia, stretching from modern-day Colombia to Ecuador, Venezuela, and Panama. For a brief moment, the dream became reality. Gran Colombia existed. So did the United Provinces of Central America. So did the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata. On paper, Latin America was moving toward unity. But paper could not defeat reality. The new nations inherited colonial borders that made little sense and political cultures that distrusted central authority. Regional elites feared that unity would simply replace Spanish rule with domination by another city: Bogotá, Buenos Aires, Mexico City. Federalism sounded good in theory, but in practice it threatened local power structures. Bolívar himself understood the danger. He warned that Latin America was ungovernable. He was not being pessimistic, he was being precise. Without shared institutions, without economic integration, and without a tradition of compromise, unity depended entirely on strong men. And strong men do not build stable unions. They build rivals. By the 1830s, Gran Colombia shattered. Central America fragmented. The Rio de la Plata dissolved into competing states. Independence had been won, but unity had been lost. And the United States? At the exact same moment Latin America was breaking apart, The US was fighting desperately to avoid the same fate. That difference, the way unity was defended in one place and abandoned in another, is where this story truly turns. To understand why Latin America fractured while the United States survived as one country, you have to look at something most people overlook: fear. Not fear of foreign enemies, but fear of internal collapse. After winning independence, the United States almost didn't survive its own success. The Articles of Confederation created a loose alliance of states that behaved like independent countries. They printed their own money, imposed tariffs on each other, and ignored federal authority. The system was so weak that by the late 1780s, the U.S. was on the edge of economic and political ruin. Shays' rebellion exposed how fragile the Union really was. But here's the critical difference. American elites were terrified of disunion more than they were afraid of central power. They had just fought a war together. Their economies were already interlinked. Most importantly, they shared a common enemy memory, Britain, and a common political language shaped by Enlightenment ideals. When the Constitution was drafted, it was not perfect, but it was a compromise everyone believed was necessary to survive. States gave up power because they believed the alternative was worse. Latin America never had that moment. Its wars of independence did not create unity, they deepened division. Regions fought not only against Spain but against each other. Royalists and patriots existed in every territory. Independence armies marched across provinces, requisitioning food, conscripting men, and leaving destruction behind. When the wars ended, there was no shared victory narrative, only exhaustion and resentment. Economic incentives pushed fragmentation even further. In the United States, the economy pushed inward. Farmers sold goods to neighboring states. Rivers connected regions. Trade created interdependence. Breaking apart would have been economically disastrous. In Latin America, economies pushed outward. Each region exported raw materials, silver, sugar, coffee, cocoa, to Europe. Trade routes bypassed neighboring territories entirely. A merchant in Caracas had little reason to care about Buenos Aires. Economic unity never formed, so political unity had nothing to stand on. Then there was the question of who held power. In the U.S., despite its flaws, political legitimacy flowed from institutions. Elections mattered. Courts mattered. The military answered to civilian authority. When disagreements arose, they were brutal, but they were debated within a shared constitutional framework. In Latin America, legitimacy flowed from men. Caudillos, strongmen backed by personal armies, rose everywhere. These leaders did not trust distant capitals. They trusted loyalty, land, and force. Unity threatened their local dominance. A strong central government meant taxes, laws, and interference. Fragmentation meant freedom to rule uncontested. Simón Bolívar understood this perfectly, and it terrified him. Bolívar initially supported federalism, inspired by the U.S. model. But reality crushed his optimism. Provinces ignored central authority. Generals defied orders. Regional elites sabotaged national projects. Bolívar eventually reversed course, arguing that Latin America needed strong centralized rule to survive. His critics accused him of seeking dictatorship. They weren't entirely wrong, but neither was he. Bolívar saw what others refused to admit. Latin America had inherited colonial societies built on inequality, slavery, and rigid class hierarchies. Democracy without social cohesion would not stabilize the region, it would fragment it faster. The U.S., for all its injustices, had a broader base of property-owning citizens invested in the system. Latin America's elites feared mass participation more than they feared disunion. So they chose control over unity. And geography kept conspiring against them. Building a central government in Washington was hard. Building one in Bogotá or Lima was exponentially harder. Roads barely existed. Armies moved slowly. Messages arrived too late. Rebellions flared before authorities even knew they had begun. Every delay weakened legitimacy. When Gran Colombia collapsed in 1831, it wasn't because unity failed overnight. It failed because no one was willing to fight for it anymore. Bolívar died in exile, bitter and defeated, famously declaring that he had plowed the sea. His dream of a united Latin America died with him, not because it was impossible but because the political cost of unity was higher than the elites were willing to pay. By the mid-19th century, the pattern was set. Fragmentation became normal. Borders hardened. National identities formed around difference, not unity. And then came the outside world, ready to exploit that division. That's when Latin America's fate diverged even further from the United States. By the time Latin America finished tearing itself apart, The rest of the world had already decided how to deal with it. Independence did not mean freedom from influence. It meant a shift in who held the strings. Spain was gone, but Britain arrived almost immediately, without soldiers, without flags, and without colonies. Instead, it came with ships, banks, insurance firms, and trade agreements. Britain did not want a strong, united Latin America. It wanted many small countries competing for access to British markets and British credit. And Latin American elites welcomed this arrangement. Fragmentation made them indispensable intermediaries. Each new republic needed loans, weapons, and international recognition. Britain supplied all three. In return, Latin America opened its ports, lowered tariffs, and tied its economies even more tightly to exports. This locked the region into dependency. A unified Latin American state could have negotiated trade collectively, protected internal industries, and balanced foreign influence. Fragmented states could not. They undercut each other. They borrowed separately. They defaulted separately. Each crisis weakened them further. The United States watched all of this closely. In 1823, Washington announced the Monroe Doctrine, declaring the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European colonization. On the surface it sounded like protection. In reality it cemented a new hierarchy. The U.S. positioned itself as the dominant power in the Americas, while Latin America remained divided and vulnerable. The irony is brutal. The United States opposed European empires, but benefited immensely from Latin America's weakness. A unified Latin American country would have been a continental rival. Dozens of small republics were manageable neighbors. This dynamic became unmistakable in the late 19th century. While the U.S. expanded westward, built railroads, and integrated its economy, Latin America struggled with internal wars, coups, and border conflicts. Countries fought each other over unclear boundaries inherited from colonial maps. Paraguay was nearly destroyed in the War of the Triple Alliance. Mexico lost half its territory to the United States. Central America fractured beyond repair. Every conflict reinforced the same lesson. Unity was no longer imaginable. Political identities hardened. Flags, anthems, and national myths replaced continental vision. Children were taught to be Chilean, Colombian, Peruvian, not Latin American. The dream Bolívar had once championed became a romantic footnote, not a political project. But the deeper damage was structural. Fragmentation weakened state capacity. Small countries struggled to build professional bureaucracies, standing armies, and national infrastructure. Corruption thrived where institutions were thin. Power remained personal rather than systemic. And every time a country attempted to centralize authority, resistance followed. Federalists accused central governments of tyranny. Conservatives accused liberals of chaos. Revolutions became cyclical. Constitutions were rewritten constantly. Stability was rare, and when it appeared, it often came through authoritarian rule rather than democratic compromise. Contrast this with the United States again. The U.S. fought a civil war that killed more people than all of Latin America's independence wars combined. But after that war, the Union became non-negotiable. Secession was settled permanently. Unity became sacred. Latin America never had that final reckoning. Instead, fragmentation was normalized. Secession succeeded early, so it remained imaginable forever. By the early 20th century, the consequences were clear. Foreign corporations controlled railways, mines, and plantations. Governments competed to offer better concessions. When workers protested, foreign powers intervened, sometimes militarily. The phrase "banana republic" wasn't an insult. It was a business model. Could unity still have been possible? In theory, yes. In practice, every incentive pushed against it. Elites feared losing control. Foreign powers preferred division. Geography resisted centralization. History reinforced mistrust. And yet, the idea never fully died. Throughout the 20th century, leaders revived the dream in new forms. Bolívar was resurrected as a symbol. Pan-American conferences were held. Regional organizations formed. But these were shadows of unity, not substitutes for it. The moment for a single nation had passed. And perhaps the most tragic part of the story is this. Latin America did not fail because it lacked vision. It failed because the structures inherited from empire made unity too expensive, and fragmentation too profitable. The United States became one country not because it was destined to, but because its leaders decided disunion was unacceptable. Latin America became many countries because too many people benefited from staying apart. And that choice still shapes the region today. History rarely turns on a single moment, but sometimes it comes close. For Latin America, That moment came between 1824 and 1830, when the wars were over, armies were still mobilized, and the idea of continental unity had not yet hardened into myth. This was the narrow window when a united state was still possible. After it closed, it never reopened. Simón Bolívar knew this. That's why he rushed. After defeating the Spanish at Ayacucho in 1824, the final blow to Spanish power in South America, Bolívar stood at the peak of his influence. He controlled armies, territory, and legitimacy. Few men in history have ever had a better opportunity to impose unity by force and then attempt to legitimize it afterward. He tried. Bolívar convened the Congress of Panama in 1826, inviting the newly independent states of Latin America to form a permanent alliance, military, political, and economic. It was the closest thing to a Latin American constitutional convention. Bolívar envisioned a league strong enough to deter foreign intervention and eventually evolve into a single state. Almost no one showed up. Mexico sent delegates with no authority to commit. Central America was already unraveling. Argentina refused outright. Chile stayed away. Even within Gran Colombia, regional leaders undermined Bolívar's authority behind the scenes. The reasons were revealing. Smaller states feared domination. Larger states feared responsibility. Everyone feared losing sovereignty, but no one defined sovereignty the same way. For local elites, sovereignty meant control over their region, not protection from foreign powers. A united Latin America threatened internal power balances more than external threats. Bolívar responded the only way he knew how. He centralized power. In 1828, facing rebellion and paralysis, Bolívar declared himself dictator of Gran Colombia. He argued that temporary authoritarianism was necessary to preserve unity. His opponents called it betrayal of republican ideals. Assassination attempts followed. Civil war loomed. This was the breaking point. Unity required force. Force destroyed legitimacy. Without legitimacy, unity could not survive. Gran Colombia fractured soon after. Venezuela and Ecuador seceded. Panama followed later. The dream collapsed not in a dramatic explosion, but in administrative exhaustion. Provinces simply stopped listening. What's important here is not that Bolívar failed, but why. The United States also faced this dilemma. Alexander Hamilton wanted a strong central government. Thomas Jefferson feared tyranny. The difference is that Americans fought their battle on paper, in conventions and courts, before fragmentation became irreversible. Latin America fought it with armies. And armies do not compromise. By the time Bolívar died in 1830, unity had become synonymous with dictatorship in the public imagination. Any future attempt to centralize power was immediately suspect. This poisoned the concept permanently. The pattern repeated elsewhere. Central America formed a federation in 1823. Within 2 decades, it collapsed into 5 countries. Mexico attempted federalism, then centralism, then empire under Iturbide, then republic again. Each failure reinforced the belief that unity was unnatural. Failure became precedent. And precedent hardened into ideology. By the late 19th century, even discussing continental unity sounded naive. Latin America had accepted its fragmentation as destiny. Borders became sacred. Wars were fought to defend them. National myths were built to justify them. Yet the irony remained. Latin America shared language, religion, legal traditions, and colonial history, far more than the 13 American colonies ever did. But similarity alone does not create unity. Institutions do. Incentives do. Power structures do. The United States built mechanisms to manage conflict. Latin America inherited structures that amplified it. And so the question shifts. It's no longer, why didn't Latin America become one country? It becomes, what kind of unity was ever possible in a world designed to prevent it? That question doesn't just belong to history. It belongs to the present. Because the forces that destroyed unity in the 19th century never disappeared. They adapted. And in some ways they became stronger. Latin America did not fail to unite because it lacked intelligence, courage, or vision. It failed because unity demanded sacrifices that too many powerful people were unwilling to make. The United States survived as one country because its elites feared fragmentation more than they feared each other. Latin America fragmented because its elites feared losing control more than they feared foreign dominance. That single difference changed everything. Once borders hardened, history did the rest. National identities replaced continental ones. Institutions grew inward, not outward. And every generation inherited a divided map and mistook it for destiny. But history is not destiny. The dream Simón Bolívar carried to his grave never disappeared. It resurfaced in alliances, unions, and movements that still struggle to overcome the same forces: geography, inequality, and power. Unity today no longer means one flag or one capital. It means coordination, strength, and independence in a world that still profits from division. So the real question isn't why Latin America didn't become one country. It's whether the future will keep paying the price for a past decision that was never truly inevitable. If this story changed how you see borders, history, and power, subscribe to Nation Scope, where the past explains the world you live in today.